So evolution, our definition we're going to use, it's a theory that species change over time. Scientific theory that's been shown by facts and observable data. And evolution can explain to us why there are so many similarities between different organisms, why many things are different from each other. Evolution can explain the diversity of living things that there are on Earth. So evolution means species change over a period of time. The species we see around us today, they didn't look like they do, they didn't act like they didn't have the same features for all of eternity. Times in the past, they may have been different from what they are today. So evolution is the change in a species over a period of time. So how do we know this, though? How do we know that species change over time? There were no humans around 10 million years ago to observe the species then. So how do we know what things looked like 10 million years ago, or 20 million, or 50 million years ago? Emily? Seeing what? But there was no one around to sort of write books about the things that were around 20 million years ago. So we don't have any like documents of them, but in a way we do. Lindsay? Sort of, but we can actually observe certain things. Aiden?
Fossils.
Yeah. You know what fossils are? What's a fossil? Jason?
Like bones.
Sort of, but they're no longer bones. They've been replaced with minerals, but they're the remains or the signs of species that were once around. So fossil evidence is a huge source of knowledge about what things were like in the past. This is an example. This is a model. It's not an actual fossil of a animal that was once around on Earth. You know what this is called? No, not a horseshoe crab. I'll pass it around. Don't drop it. It's called a trilobite. They were once found all over the world. They're no longer around. You can't find any trilobites today. Okay? Hold on. Because they're extinct. But they did once live on Earth. So we can look at fossil evidence, the remains of things that have been here for millions and millions of years, and that can tell us a little bit about what species were like far in the past. We can find fossils of trilobites, or dinosaurs, or insects, and so forth. And what we do is, as we find these fossils deep in the ground, we can tell how old they are based on what layer in the ground they're found in. So if I look at this layer, these layers of sedimentary rock, where would I find the very oldest fossils? Avery? At the bottom. The farther down you go, the deeper in time you're going, because those sedimentary rocks are built up layer after layer, time after time. And so you can tell how old something is by what layer of rock you find it in.
Like when dinosaurs, like when people found like different bones, like back, when dinosaurs just got extinct, like how did people know like what they were called?
Yeah, they did it. So when people discovered dinosaur fossils a long, long time ago, ancient times, they didn't really know exactly what they were. And so some people think that myths about dragons and so forth came about from people observing fossils of dinosaurs that they found. So yeah, people would find these fossils, and it wasn't until really modern science allowed us to figure out how old these things are, until they could start to really understand how they're related. People knew that there are these huge skeletons of these animals, but they're not around anywhere on Earth. And so they learned that they became extinct over time. So we know that species are not the same as they were today because of fossil evidence. We also could tell by looking at the structures that make up living organisms. If you look at the limbs of these creatures, a whale, a frog, a horse, a lion, a human, a bat, and a bird, now those sound like very different animals. But actually some of them are pretty closely related in terms of evolution. If you look at this, look at the human arm. So in our arm we have one upper arm bone, okay, the humerus. We have two forearm bones, the ulna and radius. We have a bunch of small bones in the wrist. We have the bones in our fingers, the phalanges. That's how our limbs are composed. If you look at a whale, the flipper of a whale, even though it looks like it's just a fin, when you look inside of it, look at the bones. There's one upper arm bone, a humerus. There's an ulna and a radius. There's wrist bones. There's even finger bones inside of a whale's flipper. Even though they don't actually have fingers, it's all covered in muscle and fat, and so it looks just like a flipper from the outside. Why does it look like that? Why is it so similar to that of a human arm bones? Jordan? What's that? Yeah, we are related. What are whales? What type of organism? They're mammals. We share a common ancestor with whales a long time in the past, but we do share a common ancestor, and therefore we have similar bone structure. And you can see a bat, same thing in a bat. Even though it looks like it's a wing like a bird, it's much different inside. They have an upper arm bone, two forearm bones, and then their finger bones are elongated with the skin of their wings stretched across them. So we can look at these sort of things and they can help us understand why they're similar, because these species evolved from common ancestors. These animals had an ancestor in the past. If we look at even plants, things like kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower. How many people like those foods? I made awesome Brussels sprouts Saturday night for dinner, by the way. With like a apple cider reduction over roasted Brussels sprouts. Really good. If you want the recipe, let me know. Anyway, all of those vegetables came from one ancestor plant, a wild mustard plant. And they have similar structures to that plant. We also know by where species are located. That species that live in the same area often are similar to other organisms in their area. And organisms that are on isolated islands often tend to be much different. What continent has lots of animals that seem a little bit strange? Lindsay? What? South America has some, but I'm thinking even stranger. Australia. Why do you think in Australia the animals, they have lots of sort of strange animals that don't really match with other types of animals around the world? Ian?
Because that's where they evolved from. That was like their habitat.
Yeah.
So they adapted to
They've been isolated on the island of Australia for a long, long time, giving them time to evolve into all these different varieties that are different from those that are sort of on the mainland where they can move from place to place. We could also examine DNA. If you compare the DNA of species, it can tell us a little bit about how related they are. Whose DNA, if we were to look at my DNA, all the bases that make up the DNA in my cells. Who would have the most similar DNA to me? Which family member? No. 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 Be more similar than my daughter to me. No. No. You're missing something? No. Somebody would share more DNA with me than I would with my father or with my mother. About how much of my father's DNA do I have? Half. Same with my mother. My daughters, how much of my DNA do they have? Half.
Would it be a grandfather?
No.
Siblings.
Yes. Siblings. My sister and I share much more of our similar DNA because we have the same parents. Okay? So our DNA is very, very similar. What if I look at the DNA of my first cousin? It would probably be very similar, but would it be the same?
No.
How about my second cousin? Each step out I go, I'm going to have less and less DNA in common with those people because we're not as closely related. Who's my common ancestor? My sister and I. Who's our common ancestor? Our parents. How about me and my first cousin? Who's our common ancestor? No, because my aunt's not my ancestor. My grandparents, right? You and your first cousin, you have the same grandparents. How about you and your second cousins? Great-grandparents. So we can continue, okay? The farther back you go, the more distantly related. And so DNA can allow us to understand this. If we compare the DNA of a human and a chimp, they share about 96% of the DNA. Is the same between a chimp and a human. They're our closest living relatives. What if you compare the DNA of a human and a raccoon? Pretty similar, but not as similar as a human and a chimp. How about the DNA of a human and a dandelion? Much different. So we can tell a little bit about by studying those relationships. We could also study these things we call vestigial structures, which are kind of neat. Often, as species evolve over time, they kind of hold on to some leftover parts that they no longer need or use anymore. An example of where this is very clear is in whales. You know, whales are mammals. Whales evolved, you know where they evolved from? What is the ancestor of a whale?
Shark.
No, the shark's a fish. A whale's a mammal. Similar to a dolphin, but all marine mammals evolved from a land-based ancestor. Kind of like a bear-like, wolf-like sort of thing. So they used to be land animals. They evolved to be sea animals. But if you look closely at the skeleton of a whale, back inside of them, they have these tiny little bones that are the leftover bones of the pelvis and the limbs of land animals. They're still inside of the whale, even though they don't do anything, even though whales don't have any hind limbs, those bones are still there. If you look at the skeleton of a snake, you'll see the same sort of thing. Even though snakes have no limbs, inside of them they have the bones where there would have been legs. Okay? So these structures can help us understand how things are related as well. And so the question becomes, how does this happen? How could this wolf-like, bear-like creature over millions of years end up being a whale? Okay? Or how could this wolf-like creature turn into dogs that we have in our homes? Okay? And it happens through this process that we call natural selection. So, in natural selection, the main concept is that living things that are well adapted to their environment, that have good traits, helpful traits and characteristics, they are going to survive better than others. And when they survive, they can then reproduce and pass on those traits. What happens to animals that are not well adapted to their environment? Kai?
They die.
They die. If we look at my little population of mice being hunted by this predator, which mice are well adapted to this?
Oh,
Area.
the one that is camouflaged the same color.
Yeah, these ones that kind of blend in. Which ones are going to survive better?
Ones that are blended in.
Yeah. What's going to happen to these light-colored ones that stand out?
They're gonna die.
Probably going to be eaten pretty easily. And so these white ones that are eaten, are they going to reproduce as much? No, because they're going to get eaten pretty early. And so over time, what would you expect would happen to this whole population of mice? If you gave them, 30 or 40,000 years, how would they change, Felice? The white ones, what about the camouflage ones? Will they become more or less common? More common. And eventually, this whole species of mice might all be dark in color. There would be none of the lighter colored ones left. We would say they've evolved over time. They've changed over time because this trait that was helpful to them gave them an advantage, helped them to survive more. Okay. So, how does this happen? We're going to talk about the steps. First, this concept is natural selection. Nature selects which organisms survive and which cannot survive. Any individual that's well suited to its environment, that has some good traits that are helpful, will be able to survive, reproduce, and then pass on its genes to the next generation. Any individual not well adapted can't survive. It can't make it. And it'll die out before reproducing. Excuse me. So over a period of time, any trait, any characteristic that's beneficial becomes more common. Any trait that's harmful becomes less common. And over time, this leads to evolution, changes in the species over time. And this evolution is why we have such a huge diversity of living organisms on Earth. Because all these different species have branched out and evolved differently, forming millions and millions of different species. Aiden? So we'll talk about that. Like for example, we call these albino mice, for example, all white. Now, can this mouse right here somehow change its fur color to dark so it blends in better? How? But it's a mouse. We can't dye its fur. So, if they're born with white fur, is there anything they can do to change that?
Yeah.
No. So, these mice, they can't. Can this mouse evolve? No. Important thing to understand, individuals can't evolve. A mouse that's born one way, it's going to live that way its entire life. It can't all of a sudden have different fur color, okay? Or have new traits, new characteristics. So one individual cannot evolve. It's the species as a whole that can. So as a whole, the species can become darker in color over a long period of time, but each individual within it cannot. They're born one way, and that's the way they stay. So we say that natural selection has 4 sort of steps. We start with variation. If we look around the room, are we all identical to each other? No. We're all different from each other. We have different heights, different hair colors and eye colors, okay? Different ways that our bodies work. We're all different. We have variation. And we see it very obviously when we look at other humans. But animals and other plants, they have variation as well. Are all squirrels identical to each other?
No.
We might sort of think they are, because like, yeah, it's a squirrel. But they have just as much variation as we do. but we don't really perceive that variation. These bears, they're all the same species. Are they identical to each other? No, there's some variation in their fur color, obviously, in their size. These ladybugs, they're all the same species, but are they identical? No, there's variation. There's random changes, random differences between them. So we have to start with that variation, that not all individuals are the same. Each individual is unique. Each individual is unique and different. So is it possible that one of these ladybugs can survive better than the other?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, maybe something about those spots make it harder for predators to find them. Okay? Maybe these bears, the lighter colored one, the bigger one can get more fish, get more food, and be more successful. So sometimes these variations allow for an individual to survive better. Because in nature, there's always a struggle for survival. Whether it's to get enough food, to find a living space, to get away from predators. In nature, there's always a struggle to survive. All of the organisms that are born cannot possibly survive. One fish can release hundreds of thousands of eggs at once. Do they all make it into adult fish? No, only a tiny percent actually make it into adult fish. Okay? Because there's limited resources. There's not enough food and energy, and there's predators and so forth. So not all of the organisms can survive. Which ones do survive?
The ones that get the food.
What's that?
The ones that get the food.
Right. Why would some get more food than others?
Because they get more better habitat.
Maybe they're stronger, bigger, smarter, more camouflage. Maybe some of these variations help them be more successful. And those that are more successful, they are going to survive better. And if they can survive, what does that mean they can do after? What do we call that? They can then reproduce. So those that survive can then reproduce. What are their offspring going to be like? The best adapted individuals survive. And because they can survive, they can reproduce. So let's say this ladybug is the most successful. For some reason, those darker spots help it survive better. When this ladybug reproduces, what are her little ladybug babies probably going to be like? Probably going to look similar to her. Okay? And therefore, are they going to survive better?
Probably, yeah.
Probably. If that was helpful to the parent, it's probably going to be helpful to the offspring. So those that survive can reproduce and pass those traits on to their offspring, pass those beneficial characteristics on. And if this repeats, generation after generation after generation, there's constantly the struggle for survival, and only some are able to survive. And the ones with the best traits survive and then reproduce. Over time, that leads to the whole species changing. The whole species taking on those characteristics that were helpful. They have adapted to their environment. And that's what we call those traits, those characteristics that help an organism survive, we call them adaptations. So this frog being camouflaged, that's an adaptation that its species developed over a long period of time, helping it to be more successful. And that's what natural selection is. Survival of those best adapted, which leads to reproduction and over time a change in the species. All right. So we'll finish up those notes tomorrow.